The Tale of the Unextinguished Moon, Chapter 2, by Boris Pilnyak. At the intersection of two of the city's main streets, where automobiles, people, and drays flowed in an endless stream, a colonnaded house stood behind an iron fence. The house gave unmistakable signs of having stood behind its paling, supported by those columns, silent, held back by the paling for a century. In the calm of that century, there was no signboard of any kind outside the house. Two helmeted sentries stood at the gates, which were surmounted by griffins. Past the house flowed people, the sounds of automobile horns, crowds, human time. Flowed the gray day. Newspaper boys, men with briefcases, women in knee-length skirts and stockings that deceived the eye, making their legs seem bare. Behind the griffins on the gates, time took its ease and seemed to be coming to a standstill. And in a different part of the city was another house, also in the classical style, behind paling, colonnaded, flanked by outbuildings, and with some mythological sense of hideous, grimacing faces on bas-reliefs. This house stood on the edge of the city. In front of it spread a square, and above the square lay gray, in this part of the city, spacious sky. Nearby rose two factory chimneys, antennas, telegraph wires. In the yard, on flower beds near the house, instead of flowers and lilacs, grew birches. Now, on this autumn day, bare, wet, drooping. Beyond the yard and the house, a steep bank fell sharply, and a river flowed. Above the meadows, beyond the river again, stretched a gray sky, factory chimneys, hamlets, a small church. The bank was overgrown with birches plundered by strong summer winds. There were two gateways to the house. Fawns made faces from the gateposts. Gatehouses stood on either side, and on benches near the gatehouses sat watchmen in aprons and felt boots, with brass badges on their aprons. A closed automobile, black with red crosses and bearing the word ambulance, stood near the gates. That day, the paper with the largest circulation carried an editorial to mark the 3rd anniversary of the return to the gold standard, which pointed out that a stable currency can exist only when the entire economic life of the country is based on strict economic consideration, on solid economic foundations. State subsidies and the management of the national economy without regard for the budget will inevitably undermine a stable financial system. In headline type appeared China's struggle against the imperialists. The foreign news section carried telegrams from England, France, Germany, Czechoslovakia, Latvia, America. Across the bottom section of one page was spread a long article entitled "The Revolutionary Movement and the Use of Force." There were also 2 pages of advertisements, among which appeared in large type "Facts of Life, Syphilis," and a new book by S. Broyd, "In the Madhouse." Incidentally, the same issue of the paper carried a goodly score of theater, variety, open stage, and cinema programs. If the day of work, fog, queues, reception rooms, solemn quiet of high-ceilinged bookkeeping halls, the chirping of the looms in cotton and wool mills, the thunder of hammers in factories and foundries, the whistles of trains departing and in motion, the roar of buses and automobiles, the prattle of streetcar bells, telephone bells, doorbells, the whining of the radio, the day of the city machine of people, men, women, children, old folk, mature people, if we look ahead and replace the day of labor and business with the evening, as time did, piling the day with twilight, spilling into the streets the light of street lamps, which in the drizzle look like weeping eyes, destroying the sky. Then, in the evening, tens of thousands of people made their way into cinemas, theaters, variety shows, open stages, taverns, and beer parlors. There, in the places of entertainment, all sorts of things were shown, entangling time, space, and countries. They showed Greeks unlike any that have actually existed, Assyrians unlike any that have actually existed, unreal Jews, Americans, Englishmen, Germans, oppressed, unreal Chinese, Russian workers, Arachayev, Pugachev, Nicholas I, Stenka Rasin. Furthermore, an ability to speak well or poorly was displayed. Good or bad legs, arms, backs, and chests were shown. An ability to dance and sing well or poorly exhibited. Furthermore, they showed all aspects of love and various amorous intrigues, such as seldom, if ever, occur in everyday life. Dressed in their best, people sat in rows, looked, listened, applauded, and streaming down the brightly lit stairs of the theaters into the wet streets, commented hurriedly, always trying to be clever. Then the streets emptied, to find rest in the night. And at night, past midnight, at the hour when in villages the first roosters crow, in houses, in beds, husbands and wives and lovers, mostly lonely couples, engaged in what animals, birds, and insects engage in at dawn and at sunset. But the day moved along its usual order, counting off the hours on clocks in offices, banks, factories, and mills, on clocks in city squares, and on pocket watches. Many times rain began to fall, and many times it stopped. Once snow began sifting down to thicken the slush on the streets. The machine of the city worked, as any machine should. At noon, a closed Rolls drew up in front of house number 1, the house which made time slow down. A sentry opened the door of the limousine, and the commander got out. In battle, when people rush into attack, they make more noise than when artillery is firing. The artillery roars louder than a regiment at an encampment. The regimental headquarters are noisier than division headquarters. In the army headquarters, rigid silence must prevail. At meetings, people shout louder than at the plenums of the Soviets. At plenums, there is more noise than in the Presidium, and it is even quieter at the meetings of the Presidium, of the provincial executive committees. In this house, unbroken silence settled. Telephone bells were muffled. Abacuses were quiet. People walked about noiselessly. People were not agitated. People did not stoop. The walls, covered with posters that had replaced paintings, stood erect. Red carpets lay on the floor. At the doors stood men with red stripes on their uniforms. In the study at the far end of the house, the heavy curtains were half drawn, and beyond the windows the street hurried by. A fire was burning in the grate. On the red felt of the desk stood 3 telephones, as if to affirm, in company with the crackling logs in the fireplace, the quietness of the room. The 3 telephones brought 3 of the city's arteries into the study, so that from its silence commands could be issued, and so that everything going on in the city's arteries could be known. On the desk stood a writing set, bronze and massive, and in the pen holder were stuck a dozen red and blue pencils. To the wall behind the desk was attached a radio receiver with 2 pairs of earphones, and rows of electric buttons were lined up like a company of soldiers at attention. From one connecting with the reception room to one marked war alarm, opposite the desk stood a leather armchair. Behind the desk, the unbending man sat on a wooden chair. The heavy curtains were half drawn, and on the desk an electric light burned under a green shade. The face of the unbending man was lost in the shadows. The commander walked across the carpet and sat down in the leather armchair. Number 1, the unbending man. It is not for us to talk about the grindstone of the revolution, Gariloff. The wheel of history, unfortunately, I suppose, is turned mainly by blood and death, particularly the wheel of revolution. It is not for you and me to talk of blood and death. You remember how the two of us led half-naked Red Army men against Yekaterino. You had a rifle, and I had a rifle. Your horse was blown up under you by a shell, and you went ahead on foot. The Red Army men started to run, and you shot one of them down with your revolver to stop the rest. Commander, you would have shot me too if I had lost my nerve, and I suppose you would have been right. Number 2, the commander. Well, you've got a nice little setup here. Quite the minister. Is smoking allowed? I don't see any cigarette butts. Number 1, don't smoke. You shouldn't. Your health doesn't permit it. I don't smoke myself. Number 2, curtly. Come to the point. What have you brought me here for? Don't play the diplomat with me. Let's hear it. Number 1, I have asked you to come here because you need an operation. You are a man the revolution cannot spare. I called in the professors and they said you'll be on your feet in a month. The revolution demands it. The professors are waiting for you. They'll examine you and find out what's wrong with you. I have already given the order. There's even a man from Germany. Number 2, you do as you like, but I'll smoke anyway. My doctors told me there's no need for an operation, that everything will heal by itself. I feel perfectly well. There's no need at all for an operation. I don't want one. Number 1 stuck his hand behind him, felt for a button on the wall, rang. A noiseless secretary entered. Number 1 asked, Is there anyone waiting to see me? The secretary replied in the affirmative. Number 1 made no reply. Dismissed the secretary. Number 1. Comrade Commander, you remember how we debated whether or not to send 4,000 men to certain death? You ordered them to be sent. You were right. In 3 weeks, you'll be on your feet. You must forgive me, but I have already given the order. A telephone rang, not the city telephone, but the internal one, which had no more than 30 or 40 lines. Number 1 picked up the receiver, listened, asked a question, said, A note to the French? An official one, of course, as we said yesterday. You understand. Remember how we fish for trout? The French are a very slippery lot. What? Yes. Get things moving. So long. Number 1. You must forgive me, but there is nothing further to discuss, Comrade Goriloff. The commander finished his cigarette, stuck the butt in among the red and blue pencils, got up from the chair. The commander. Goodbye. Number 1. So long. The commander walked over red carpets to the entrance. The rolls carried him into the noise of the streets. The unbending man remained in the study. No one else came to see him. Unbending, he sat over his papers, a fat red pencil in his hand. He rang. The secretary came in. He said, See that the cigarette butt is removed from here, from this stand. And again, he was silent, over his papers, red pencil in hand. 1 hour passed, and another, and still the man sat over his papers, working. Once a telephone rang. He listened and replied, 2 million rubles worth of galoshes and textiles to Turkestan to plug up the hole in consumer goods? Yes, of course, go to it. So long. An attendant came in noiselessly, put down a tray with a glass of tea and a piece of cold meat covered with a napkin on a small table by the window, went out. Then the unbending man rang from his secretary again, asked, Is the confidential summary ready? The secretary replied in the affirmative. Bring it in. And once more, the man was silent for a long time, over a large sheet of paper, over columns headed People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, Political and Economic Divisions of OGPU, People's Commissariat of Finance, People's Commissariat of Foreign Trade, People's Commissariat of Labor. Then, into the study, walked 2 men, the other 2 of the troika that ruled. Over the city moved a yellow day, steeped in foggy haze. Toward 3 o'clock, alleys and the sky began turning blue and gray. The sky, like a huge factory, began trading in quilts, greasy to the point of a grey gloss. At 4 o'clock, when the city began shedding tears from the wet glass of its street lamps made up like the eyes of prostitutes, when there were more people on the streets than usual, when automobile horns roared, factory and train whistles blew, and streetcars clattered, several automobiles pulled up outside house number 2 on the outskirts of the city. The house hugged the darkness as if darkness could warm the dampness that pervaded it. The windows that faced the open spaces beyond the river were burning with the reflection of the last slit of sunset. And there, beyond the open spaces, this slit oozed, poured forth clotted, purplish gore. At the gates of the house, 2 militiamen took up positions next to the watchmen in aprons and felt boots. At the main entrance to the house, 2 more militiamen took up positions. An officer with 2 orders of the Red Banner, supple as a willow rod, entered the front door with 2 Red Army men. In the house, it was an hour of rest. Quiet was descending. Only somewhere in some remote room a nurse was singing a muted song. Oh, she will go to the river bank to look at the river, how fast it flows. The officer and the Red Army men were met in the entrance hall by a man in a white gown. Yes, 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 of course. And then the nurse's song about the river broke off. The windows in the examination room faced the open spaces beyond the river. There were no curtains on the windows. The walls were painted white, and white electric light streamed from the ceiling. There were no telephones in the room. The room was vast and empty. Its center was taken up by a tablecloth with white oilcloth, around which stood oilcloth-covered high-backed chairs, the standard variety found in railroad stations. Along the wall stood an oilcloth-covered couch with a sheet over it, and by the couch, a wooden stool. In a corner, on a glass shelf, above a wash basin, were arranged medicine bottles with various labels, a huge bottle of mercury chloride, a jar of green soap. Nearby hung yellowish, unbleached towels. The first automobiles to arrive brought professors, therapists, surgeons. People in frock coats and black jackets walked into the examination room. These people removed the coats and put on white gowns. Beyond the windows, the blood-tinged ooze of the sunset across the river had faded. People came in, exchanged greetings. They were met by the man in charge, tall, bearded, bald, with a good-natured face. In a vast majority of cases, men of science, and medicine in particular, are for some reason very ugly. Their jaws are either too small or are overdeveloped so that they extend beyond their ears. Their eyes are almost always behind glasses or near their temples or crawling into the very corners of their eye sockets. To some, fate denied the blessing of hair, and on their necks grew sparse tufts of beard. With others, hair pushes up not only on jaws and chins, but on nose and ears as well. Perhaps it is this circumstance that has created among scientists the tradition of eccentricity. Every scientist must, without fail, be eccentric. What is more, his eccentricity augments his erudition. At this time, though, there was probably no eccentric behavior in the examination room. The man who greeted the people as host, a surgeon, a professor, overgrown with hair to the extent that it grew on his nose, was quaint only on the account of his abundant brown hair, into which was set a small pair of spectacles. There was also something quaint about the shine of his bald head. Coming forward to greet him was Professor Lozovsky, a man of about 35, clean-shaven, wearing a frock coat and a pince-nez with a straight cross-piece, his eyes hiding in the inner corners of their sockets. Yes, 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 of course. The clean-shaven man handed the hairy one a wax-sealed envelope that had been torn open. The hairy man took out the sheet of paper, adjusted his spectacles, read it, again adjusted his spectacles, and, with a puzzled expression, passed it on to a third man. The clean-shaven man, solemnly. A secret paper, as you can see, almost an order. It was sent to me this morning. You understand. First, second, third, snatches of conversation, whispered, hurried. How does the consultation come into this? I came because of an urgent summons. There was a telegram addressed to the rector of the university. Army Commander Garloff, you know. The one who... Yes, of course, the revolution. The man in command of the army, the usual formula. And then, if you please, a consultation. Have you seen him, gentlemen? Comrade Garloff. What sort of a man is he? Yes, of course, my good man. The electric light made sharp-cut shadows. The wound of the sunset carried with it into the darkness the wide spaces beyond the river. Someone took hold of someone else by the button of the breast pocket of his white gown. Someone took someone else's arm to stroll about the room. Then, loudly, slowly, calmly, first, second, third. Professor Opal's report at the Convention of Surgeons on Internal Secretion. I opposed. The duodenum. Today in the House of Scientists. Thank you. My wife was well. The oldest boy has a touch of colitis. And how is Yekaterina Pavlovna? Pavel Ivanovich, your article in the Community Doctor. Then, from the doorway, came the clang of rifles and the stamp of heels. The Red Army men froze to immobility. In the doorway appeared the tall, slender youth, supple as a whip, with the orders of the red banner on his chest. Came to attention, facing the door. The commander walked quickly into the examination room, pushed his hair back with one hand, adjusted the collar of his tunic, said, Good day, comrades. Am I to undress? Then, without haste, the professors sat down on the oilcloth-covered chairs around the table, put their elbows on the table, rubbed their hands, adjusted their spectacles and pince-nez, asked the patient to sit down. The man who had passed the envelope around, the one whose eyes had grown deep into their sockets behind his straight pince-nez, said to the hairy man, Pavel Ivanovich, I suppose that as primus inter pares, you will have no objection to taking the chair? Am I to undress? Asked the commander, and put his hand on his collar. The chairman of the consultation, Pavel Ivanovich, gave no sign of having heard the commander's question, and said slowly, taking his place at the head of the table, I suppose we ought to ask the patient when he first became aware of the onset of the disease and what pathological indications made him realize he was ill. After that, we'll examine the patient. A sheet of paper covered with illegible professorial script remains as evidence of this meeting of professors. The paper was yellow, unlined, rough-edged, made from wood pulp, the kind of paper that, according to engineering specialists, should disintegrate in 7 years. The report of the consultation in which Professor so-and-so, Professor so-and-so, Professor so-and-so, and so on 7 times took part. The patient, citizen Nikolai Ivanovich Garilov, appeared before us, complaining of pain in the epigastric region, vomiting, heartburn. He fell ill 2 years ago without realizing that there was anything wrong at first, was given outpatient treatment and visited health resorts. No improvement. At the request of the patient, a consultation of the above-mentioned was called. Status: Prasenz. Patient's general condition satisfactory. Lungs, heart, slight enlargement, and accelerated pulse observed. Mild neurasthenia, other organs apart from stomach, no pathological symptoms observed. It was agreed that in all probability the patient is suffering from an ulcus ventriculi and that an operation is necessary. Those taking part in the consultation suggest that Professor Anatoly Komzvich Lozovsky should operate. Professor Pavel Ivanovich Kokosov has agreed to assist. City, date, signatures of the 7 professors. Subsequently, When the operation was over, it became clear from private conversations that not a single professor had in fact judged the operation to be in the least necessary, being of the opinion that the form which the disease had taken did not indicate an operation. But nothing was said of this during the consultation. Only the taciturn German expressed the view that the operation was unnecessary, although he did not persist in face of his colleagues' objections. And it was also told that, as Professor Kokosov, the one whose eyes were overgrown with hair, was getting into his automobile to go to the House of Scientists after the consultation, he said to Professor Lozovsky, "You know, if a brother of mine had this disease, I wouldn't operate." To which Professor Lozovsky replied, "Yes, of course, but it's a safe operation after all." The engine came to life and the automobile began to move. Lozovsky settled down comfortably, straightened out the skirt of his coat, leaned over toward Kokosov, and whispered so the driver would not hear. A frightening character, that Gorolov. No emotion, no subtle shades about him. Am I to address? I, you see, consider the operation inessential, but if you comrades think it is necessary, just indicate the time and the place where I must present myself for operation. Briefly and precisely. Yes, of course, my good man. A Bolshevik, you know. What can we do? Said Kokosov. In the evening of that day, at the hour when thousands of people crowded cinemas, theaters, variety shows, taverns, and beer parlors, when crazy automobiles gobbled up street puddles with their headlights, carving up those headlights crowds of people on the sidewalks that look quaint in the lights, when in the theaters entangling time, space, and countries, entangling non-existent Greeks, Assyrians, Russian, and Chinese workers, citizens of the American and Soviet republics, actors by a variety of means forced the spectators to remain silent, or to applaud. At that hour, above the city, above the puddles, above the houses, rose the moon, for which the city had no use. Clouds moved swiftly, and it seemed that the moon was frightened, was in a hurry, ran, jumped to be on time, not to be late somewhere. White moon against blue clouds and black abysses in the sky. At that hour, the unbending man in house number 1 was still sitting in his study. Drawn curtains completely covered the windows. Again, a fire was burning in the grate. The house was steeped in silence, as if silence had been hoarded for a century. The man was sitting on his wooden chair. This time, thick books in German and English lay open before him. He was writing with pen and ink in his vertical script, in Russian on German linen paper. The books lying open in front of him concerned statecraft, law, and the use of power. Light fell from the ceiling of the study, and now the man's face could be seen. It was a very ordinary face, perhaps just a little hard, but there was a great concentration and no sign of weariness in it. The man sat for a long time over his books and his writing pad. Then he rang, and a stenographer came in. He began to dictate. The landmarks of his speech were the USSR, America, Britain, the world, and the USSR, British sterling and Russian poods of wheat, American heavy industry, Chinese manpower. The man spoke loudly and firmly, and every phrase was a formula. The moon was moving over the city. At that hour, the commander was sitting in Popov's room, in a large hotel where only party members stayed. They had moved in 1918, when in the smoke of rebellions, communists had to stay close together. The hotel room was large, luxuriously furnished, but like all rooms in all hotels, it suggested something temporary, something of the road which in its essence is adverse to comfort. There were 3 of them, Gorolov, Popov, and Popov's 2-year-old daughter, Natashka. Popov lolled on the sofa, Gorolov sat by the table, and Natashka fidgeted on his lap. Gorolov was lighting matches one after another. Natashka looked at the flame with the wonder that only a child can feel before the mysteries of this world. Then she stuck out her lips and blew at the flame. It took more than one puff to put out a match, but when it did go out, there was such amazement, such delight, and such awe in Natashka's blue eyes in the presence of this mystery that it was impossible not to light another match, impossible not to bow one's head before the mystery that was Natashka herself. Later, Garalov put Natashka to bed, sat down by her crib, and said, "You close your eyes, and I'll sing you a song." And he began to sing, not knowing how, not knowing a single song, making up a song on the spot. There came a goat and said, "Sleep, sleep, 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 sleep." He smiled, looked slyly at Natasha and Popov, and sang the first thing that came into his head that was consonant with the word sleep, sleep, sleep. He sang, "There came a goat and said, sleep, 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 but don't pee, 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 pee." Natashka opened her eyes and smiled, and Garalov went on singing the last two lines in his unpracticed voice. He really couldn't sing, and Natashka fell asleep. Then Garalov and Popov drank tea together. Carrying a red teapot on which was written in white enamel to Comrade Popov from the workers of the Lisev factory on the 5th anniversary of October, carrying this teapot, Popov went to the boiler in the kitchen to fetch some hot water. On a spread newspaper he set out glasses, plates of butter and cheese. Sugar was in a bag, bread in another bag. Popov asked, "Shall I make you some gruel, Nikolka?" They sat facing each other, talking slowly, in low voices, taking their time. Much tea was drunk. Garalov had unbuttoned the collar of his tunic and was drinking from his saucer. As they were drinking their second glass of tea, after talking about this and that, Popov pushed away his half-empty glass and said after a pause, "My Zina walked out on me, Nikolka, leaving the child on my hands. She ran off with some engineer she was in love with before. Devil knows who he is. I have no wish to judge her. I don't want to dirty myself by calling her names, but still, you have to admit, she ran off like a bitch, on the sly, without a word. It's hard to think that she never loved me, but lived with me as a kept woman on account of my position. But still, it turned out that she left me for the sake of silk stockings, perfume, face powder, and what have you. And I'm ashamed of myself. I pulled her out of a hole. It was at the front. Took care of her, loved her, and like a fool took her to my heart, and she turned out to be a spoiled miss. I never really got to know the woman who lived with me for 5 years." And Popov went into all the trivial details of the separation, details which are always so painful because of their very triviality. The triviality that obscures the things that really matter. Then they began to talk about their children, and Garalov spoke of his family life, his 3 little ones, his wife, who was no longer young, but who'd always be the only woman in the world for him. For a long time they talked about Natasha. How could Popov take care of her when he did not even know how to put her properly on a potty, or rock and hum her to sleep? Popov showed Garalov some books by Vodovosova, Montessori, Pinkovich. He spread his arms in a gesture of helplessness, and all the time they drank cold tea. The moon hurried over the city. At the hour when city streets were becoming empty to rest in the night, and in villages the first roosters began crowing, when people digesting their suppers, the impressions and clever maxims of the day, husbands, wives, lovers were crawling into their beds, Garalov was taking his leave of Popov. "Give me something to read, but make it simple, something about good people, about real love, something like childhood and boyhood," Garalov said. Every corner of Popov's room was heaped with books, but a simple book about simple human love, simple relationships, simple life, a book about the sun, about human beings and simple human joy, such a book was not to be found at Popov's. "That's revolutionary literature for you," Garalov said jokingly. "All right, then, I'll read Tolstoy again. I like that bit about the old gloves worn at the ball." And Garalov's face darkened. He paused, said quietly, "I didn't tell you, Alyoshka, so as not to waste time in useless talk. I saw the chief today, and I also went to the hospital to see the professors. That bunch put on a great show of learning. I don't want to be cut up. Everything in me is against it. Tomorrow I have to go under the knife. Do come to the hospital. Don't forget the old man. Don't write anything to my wife and children. Goodbye." And Garoloff left the room without shaking Popov's hand. A closed automobile was standing in front of the hotel. Garoloff got in, said, "Home, to the station," and the automobile nosed into narrow streets. In the sidings, the moon slithered over the rails. A dog ran past, yelped, and vanished where the rails stretched silently away into the darkness. A sentry stood at the footboard of the car. He froze to attention as the commander passed. The orderly suddenly materialized in the corridor. The attendant poked his head out, electric lights flashed on in the car, and a real provincial silence, deep, unbroken, descended. The commander went through to his sleeping compartment, took off his boots, put on his slippers, unbuttoned the collar of his tunic, rang, "Tea!" He went into the lounge, sat down by the table lamp. The attendant brought tea, but the commander left it untouched. The commander sat for a long time over childhood and boyhood, reading, thinking. Then he went into the sleeping compartment, returned with a large writing pad, rang, said to his orderly, "Ink, please," and began writing slowly, deliberately, over each sentence. He wrote one letter, read it through, thought it over, sealed it in an envelope. He wrote a second letter, thought it over, sealed it. And he wrote a third letter, a very short one, wrote it hastily, sealed it unread. A numb silence filled the car. The sentry stood motionless by the footboard. Orderly and attendant were motionless in the corridor. It seemed that time itself was motionless. For a long time the letters in their white addressed envelopes lay in front of the commander. Then the commander took a large envelope, sealed all 3 letters in it, and on the envelope wrote, "To be opened after my death." Casually he got up to go to bed. In the sleeping compartment he removed his tunic, then went out to wash before bedtime, got undressed, lay down, turned off the lights, and for 3 or 4 hours the car remained in darkness and silence. This was the hour of the third rooster's crowing. If at the time the attendant had peeked into the commander's compartment, he would have seen to his surprise a red glow of a cigarette at the spot where the commander's head was supposed to be. To his surprise, because usually the commander did not smoke. And the bell from the commander's compartment rang sharply, summoning the attendant. The commander spoke in the tones of an army leader. "My clothes? Great coat. Call the garage. A racer, 2-seater, open top. I'll drive myself. Get the House of Soviets. Popov's number." The commander said into the receiver to Popov, "Alexei, I'm leaving to fetch you now. Come down to the entrance. This is Garloff speaking. Don't delay." The 2-seater, 100-horsepower racer jerked from the spot in second gear, swinging fan-like, casting shafts of white light. The chauffeur jumped out of the way. The army commander was at the wheel. The horn bellowed. The automobile began snipping splinters of puddles, alleys, shop and institution signs, tearing wind and space. Popov stood in sleepy bewilderment. The automobile must have given the rubber of its tires a good punishing, pulling up hard in front of the entrance to the House of Soviets. Popov got in silently, and the automobile began hurling back streets, alleys, the splash of puddles, the lights of street lamps. The air grew firmer and firmer, bursting into the howling of the wind, whistled inside the automobile, became icy and biting. Street lamps at crossings swung their lights, swooped down and retreated headlong. One militiaman, then another, blew his whistle, but the automobile had already torn itself free of the pile of houses and streets and was leaving the city limits, at first, into the open spaces of vacant lots, with the occasional streetcar line gas burner, then into the black gloom of the fields. It was in top gear. Air and wind had gone crazy, slashing, stopping the breath. The highway beneath the automobile had long since merged into a smooth, white flatness. obscuring the hollows on the road and the piles of stone along the edges. Only when the hollows were especially large, the automobile would take off and fly a few feet through the air, losing the noise of stones flying from under the tires. Once, twice, 3 times, the automobile's lights struck walls of village huts. The huts scattered like sheep, and the village was left behind in a yelping of dogs. In a dip between 2 hills, the automobile lights became entangled in the shaggy gray locks of an autumn mist, and it became clear that even a mist can fly, screech, rush, howl like a snowstorm, and prick the face like a blizzard. Garaloff sat bent over the wheel, all attention, precision, and calculation, forcing the automobile forward, 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 harder, harder, faster. Popov had long been down on all fours on the floor of the automobile, convulsively holding on to the floor with both hands and not looking out. In this way, in the space of less than an hour, the automobile broke through a distance of 100 versts or so. There, at the edge of some old forest, the automobile lost speed, grew weak, fell silent, let wind and cold go their way, stood the rushing slant sleet upright, vertical. The automobile stopped. Popov sat down in his seat. Garaloff said, "Give me a cigarette, Alyosha." Popov answered, "To the devil with you and all these tricks. My liver has gone down to my heels. There, have your smoke, damn you." Garaloff lit up, leaned restfully against the back of the seat, said meditatively, "When I'm overworked, when I'm at my wit's end, I take the automobile and race. This racing puts me and my thoughts in order. I remember every single one of these races, and I remember the smallest details of everything that happened during these races. All the conversations, all the phrases, down to the intonation of the voice, down to the way in which a cigarette stub glowed. I've got a bad memory. I forget everything. I don't even remember what happened in the crucial days of battles. They told me about it afterwards, but these races, I remember perfectly. Just now, I was driving like a madman with a 99% chance of having a smash-up, but my every movement is precise, and it's not possible to have a smash-up. I am intoxicated with the incomprehensible intoxication of precision. But if we did have a smash-up, I'd only be glad. Let's talk." Garaloff threw away the cigarette stub with an energetic gesture, drew himself up straight, fell silent, no doubt listening to himself, fell silent, solemnly, proudly. "On the other hand, no need to say anything. We'll have a talk later. Sit still. We'll have another race. I feel good, because this racing, this rush forward, is what a man should live for, is what makes life worth living, and for the sake of which we live. We've said everything to each other with our lives. Sit still. There are times when it's better not to say anything," said Garaloff proudly, and the automobile began tearing up spaces on the return journey, stunning wind, time, mist, villages, forcing time and mist to dance a wild dance, to shout and run. All this to force Popov down on all fours again, to hook his hands to whatever turned up, whatever held firm, to shut his eyes tight in fear and send his liver down to his heels. From the hill over the city, the entire city was visible for several moments. Down there in the mist, in the dim lights and reflections of lights, in the distant murmur and noise, the city seemed to be very miserable. The automobile approached the city limits at the hour, at the gray dawn hour, when factory whistles sound over the city.